It begins on a warm summer evening, June 9th, 1912. The small town of Villisca, Iowa rested under a sky painted gold and crimson, unaware that the night ahead would stain its history forever. The streets were quiet. Families locked their doors. The faint glow of kerosene lamps flickered through lace curtains. Nothing seemed out of place. But behind one of those glowing windows in a modest white house on East 2nd Street, 8 souls were preparing for bed, unaware that none of them would see the sunrise. The Moore family was well known in Villisca. Josiah Moore, the father, was a respected businessman who ran a local hardware store. His wife, Sarah, was deeply involved in the church. Together, they had 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. That Sunday had been full of joy. The family attended the Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church. Sarah had organized the event herself, and it was a success. The laughter of children echoed through the pews. Hymns filled the air, and everyone seemed content. That night, the Moore family had 2 young guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, friends of Catherine's who lived nearby. The girls were excited to sleep over. After church, the group returned home, shared cookies and milk, and went to bed in high spirits. It should have been an ordinary night. Around midnight, as the town slept under a thin veil of mist, someone walked the dirt road leading to the Moore house. The sound of heavy boots pressed against the earth, steady, deliberate. A faint creak of the back door broke the silence. It had been left unlocked, and as most homes in Villisca were. Inside, the air was still. The intruder moved carefully, striking a single match to light a small oil lamp. The chimney of the lamp had been removed, dimming the light to a soft orange glow. In that faint shimmer, the figure looked around the parlor, where an axe leaned quietly against the wall, Josiah Moore's own tool, used for chopping wood. The visitor lifted it. The house was small, but the intruder seemed to know the layout. First, they moved toward the master bedroom. Josiah and Sarah lay asleep, unaware of the shadow standing over them. The axe rose once, twice, then fell with a sickening, muffled sound. No screams, no struggle. Just silence, thick and absolute. The killer then turned to the children's rooms. One by one, the axe came down again, methodically, almost ritualistically. After the Moore children were gone, the figure crept upstairs to the Stillinger sisters. The youngest, Ina, may have woken in the final seconds of her life. She was found with defensive wounds, a small sign that she had seen her killer. By dawn, the Moore house had become something no one in Villisca could have imagined. A scene so brutal, it seemed born from madness. The next morning, a neighbor, Mary Peckham, noticed something strange. The Moore house was unusually quiet. No one had come out to feed the chickens. The curtains were still drawn. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. By 8 a.m., she called Josiah's brother, Ross. Ross arrived with his spare key. He pushed open the door, calling out for his family. The air inside was heavy, thick with something he couldn't name. He stepped through the parlor, then toward the first bedroom. What he saw stopped him cold. A sheet was pulled over a figure in bed, and beside it, dark stains spread across the pillow. He ran back outside, shouting for the marshal. Within an hour, word spread through town like wildfire. Hundreds of people gathered outside the White House on East 2nd Street. The marshal entered and quickly realized the scale of the horror. Every bed in the house held bodies. Each one had been struck repeatedly with the blunt end of an axe. The heads of Josiah and Sarah were unrecognizable. The killer had even covered the mirrors and windows with clothing or blankets, as if trying to hide from something, maybe from himself. But there was more. Beside the bed, investigators found a strange piece of bacon, neatly placed on the floor, and a bowl of bloody water. In the kitchen, another piece of bacon rested on the counter, wrapped in a dish towel. A lamp was found at the foot of the bed, its wick bent as though intentionally adjusted to dim the flame. The killer had even placed a piece of cloth over Josiah's face after the murder. Every move seemed deliberate, ritualistic, almost as if guided by obsession. The town was paralyzed with fear. People locked their doors for the first time in years. Parents slept with guns nearby. Children refused to walk alone. The whispers began. Who could have done something like this? Some said it was a drifter. Others believed it was someone local. The brutality of the crime suggested rage, but the method suggested calm. Whoever had done this wasn't in a hurry. They had stayed in the house for hours, maybe even cooked food before leaving. The killer had waited until dawn, then vanished into the morning fog. Reporters flooded Villisca. The case became a national sensation. The words Villisca axe murders appeared in headlines from New York to Chicago. Everyone had a theory, but none fit perfectly. There was the Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had attended the same church service that night. He was eccentric, unstable, and known for strange behavior. Witnesses claimed they saw him leaving town on the early morning train. Later, he sent bizarre letters to investigators, describing details of the crime that only the killer could have known. But Kelly also had a reputation for mental illness. Some said he was simply obsessed with the tragedy, not responsible for it. Then there was Frank Jones, Josiah Moore's former employer. Rumor had it that Josiah had left Jones's store years earlier on bad terms, taking key clients with him. There were whispers of jealousy, revenge, and even an affair between Josiah and Jones's daughter-in-law. But Frank Jones was powerful, well-connected, and nothing could be proven. The police were overwhelmed. They questioned dozens of suspects, searched trains, and even followed traveling carnivals. But every lead turned to dust. The only thing that grew was the fear that a killer capable of such horror was still walking free. As the weeks passed, Villisca began to unravel. The town that once trusted everyone now trusted no one. Neighbors eyed each other in silence. Families stopped attending church together. The children of Villisca learned to sleep with their lights on. The Moore house stood empty, a monument to unanswered questions. The scent of blood faded, but the fear lingered. And somewhere out there, a person who had done the unthinkable watched as the world tore itself apart searching for him. No one knew it then, but the Villisca murders were more than a tragedy. They were the start of something darker, a mystery that would haunt generations. And the deeper investigators dug, the stranger the evidence became. Because what they found next hinted that this wasn't just murder. It was ritual. The morning after the murders, Villisca changed forever. What had once been a quiet farming town became the center of a nightmare that refused to fade. By sunrise, news had spread to every corner of Iowa. Reporters, police, and curious strangers arrived in droves. The streets filled with carriages and horses. The smell of fear mixed with the stench of blood and sweat that hung in the humid June air. The Moore house stood silent behind its small white fence. The curtains were still drawn, and a police officer guarded the entrance trying to keep back the growing crowd. But it was too late. Dozens of townspeople had already entered the home before police could seal it off. They walked from room to room, stepping over evidence, whispering prayers, and leaving fingerprints on the walls. One woman even cut a piece of Josiah's bedsheet as a souvenir. The crime scene was destroyed before the investigation had even begun. When investigators finally took control, what they found inside was more chilling than anyone could have imagined. Blood covered the walls and ceilings. Every mirror and window had been draped with cloth. The killer had taken his time, moving methodically from bed to bed. All the victims were covered with sheets or blankets after death, except for young Lena Stillinger. Her body was found in a position that suggested she had been awake, perhaps even aware of what was happening. Her nightgown was pulled above her waist. Investigators whispered about the possibility of sexual assault, though there was no physical proof. Still, it added a new layer of horror to the already grotesque scene. As investigators pieced together the events, they realized that the weapon, Josiah's own axe, had been wiped clean and left leaning against the wall. The killer had also left behind a pan of bloody water, likely used to wash his hands, and a strange slab of bacon placed near the bodies. It wasn't random. It felt symbolic, ritualistic, even purposeful, but no one could say what it meant. The police were baffled. There was no sign of forced entry, no stolen valuables, and no clear motive. It looked like the killer had come not for money, but for something else. The first suspect was the traveling preacher, Reverend George Kelly. He had preached at the Children's Day service that same night. Witnesses recalled him behaving oddly. He asked young girls about sleeping arrangements, watched them closely, and made inappropriate comments. He boarded the 5 a.m. train out of Villisca the next morning, heading to a nearby town. On the train, passengers reported that Kelly talked about the murders and before anyone in that town even knew they had happened. When police interviewed him, Kelly gave long, rambling answers. He claimed that God had spoken to him, that he could hear divine voices guiding his thoughts. Later, he confessed to the murders, saying he had killed them while in a trance. But his story changed with every telling. Sometimes he said he killed them because God told him to cleanse the world of sin. Other times he said he only dreamed he had done it. The authorities didn't know what to believe. Kelly was small, frail, and mentally unstable. Could someone like him have carried out such a savage crime? Some said yes. Others laughed at the idea. Then came whispers about another suspect, Frank Jones, Josiah Moore's former employer. Jones was a powerful man in town, a respected businessman and politician. Years earlier, Josiah had worked at his store but left after a bitter dispute. Rumor had it that Josiah had taken key clients with him when he started his own business, including one of Jones's biggest accounts. There were also stories of jealousy, that Josiah had been too friendly with Jones's daughter-in-law. The idea that a respected man like Frank Jones could be behind such a crime seemed absurd to many, but others weren't so sure. The murders were personal, brutal, and filled with rage. Some believed Jones might have hired someone to do the job, a hitman named William Mansfield. Mansfield had a violent past and was suspected in several axe murders across the Midwest. Detectives dug deeper and found shocking similarities between the Villisca murders and other cases. Just months earlier, in Ellsworth, Kansas, an entire family had been found murdered in their beds, all killed with an axe, all mirrors covered. A few weeks later, in Colorado Springs, another family was slaughtered in the same way. Then in Monmouth, Illinois, another. The pattern was identical. Investigators began to suspect that the Villisca murders weren't an isolated event. They were part of a series, a string of killings that followed the railroad lines across America's heartland. The thought chilled everyone, that the murderer might not be a neighbor or a preacher, but a drifter who rode the trains from town to town, slaughtering families as he went. In 1912, America's rail system connected even the smallest towns. Each night, trains rumbled through Villisca's quiet streets, their whistles echoing in the dark. It wasn't hard to imagine a stranger stepping off one of those trains, committing an unspeakable act, and vanishing again into the night. Investigators followed the theory, tracing train routes and tracking transient workers. But the case grew colder by the day. For every suspect, there was an alibi. For every clue, a contradiction. Meanwhile, Reverend Kelly was arrested again after sending a strange letter to investigators, detailing things only the killer could know. When pressed, he gave another confession, this one even more detailed than before. He claimed he had followed the family home after the church event, slipped into the house after midnight, and carried out the killings under the command of God. The police thought they finally had their man. Kelly was put on trial in 1917, 5 years after the murders. The courtroom overflowed with journalists, townspeople, and curious onlookers. The prosecution painted him as a deranged preacher obsessed with young girls, driven by religious mania. The defense argued that his confession was coerced and that his mental illness made him unreliable. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only an hour. They couldn't reach a verdict. The trial ended in a hung jury. A second trial followed, but the outcome was the same. Kelly was acquitted. And just like that, the only man ever tried for the Villisca axe murders walked free. For Villisca, there was no peace. The case had torn the town apart. Neighbors accused each other. Families moved away. The church where Sarah Moore once sang hymns became a place of whispered prayers for safety. The Moore house remained empty, its windows boarded up, its yard overgrown with weeds. Children crossed the street rather than walk past it. Some said at night, the faint glow of a lantern could still be seen moving through the rooms. Others swore they heard footsteps on the porch long after midnight. Reporters left. Investigators retired. But the questions never stopped. Who killed the Moore family and their guests? Why cover the mirrors? Why leave bacon near the bodies? Why stay so long after the murders? Theories multiplied. Ritual killings, religious mania, secret societies. Some said the murderer was a Satanist. Others said he was a man possessed, but one thing was certain. Whoever had swung that axe was not an ordinary killer. He was something darker. The town of Villisca would never be the same again. And as the years passed, the mystery only deepened, because evidence soon surfaced suggesting that the killer may not have stopped in Villisca. He might have kept going, following the trains, leaving a trail of blood across the Midwest. And if that was true, then Villisca was just one stop in a far deadlier journey. The more investigators studied the Villisca case, the more disturbing the connections became. It wasn't just the brutality of the murders that haunted them, but the precision, the ritual, and the eerie familiarity of it all. By late 1912, lawmen began comparing notes with other towns that had suffered similar tragedies. Soon, a chilling realization spread across the Midwest. The Moore family wasn't the first, and they weren't the last. In several small towns connected by the same rail lines, families had been murdered in almost identical ways. The pattern was undeniable. The killer struck at night, usually after midnight. He chose homes near train tracks. He killed everyone inside, often while they slept. He used an axe, always one found at the scene. He covered the mirrors, locked the doors, and vanished before sunrise. The list of towns was long: Ellsworth, Kansas; Monmouth, Illinois; Colorado Springs, Colorado; Paola, Kansas; Rainier, Washington, each with the same silent horror, the same signature. Entire families wiped out in a single night. Detectives started calling him the man from the train. No one knew his name, but everyone knew his work. He traveled under cover of darkness, stepping off a passing train with no one noticing, walking to the edge of town, and choosing a house at random. When his work was done, he'd clean his weapon, cover the mirrors, and slip back onto the next train heading west. In those days, the trains ran everywhere and stopped in every small town. There were no security checks, no cameras, no one to question a stranger buying a cheap ticket. He could travel for months, unseen and unknown. As 1913 began, newspapers finally caught on. Headlines screamed about the Axeman and the Midnight Butcher. Panic spread across the Midwest. Families began locking their doors for the first time. Some even stayed awake all night, guns in hand, waiting for a sound that never came. Others moved closer to town centers, hoping the killer wouldn't strike in crowded neighborhoods. But the killings didn't stop. In January 1914, the first family in Lafayette, Louisiana, was found dead in their beds, their skulls crushed with an axe. A Bible was open on the dining table. Just like Villisca, the mirrors were covered. 2 months later, another family in Texas, then another in Mississippi. Everywhere he went, he left the same ghostly calling card, the same silence, the same fear. The newspapers began calling him America's first serial killer. But this was long before the term existed. Back then, people believed murder had reasons: money, revenge, jealousy. But this man seemed to kill for something else entirely. Detectives from Iowa and Kansas met secretly to compare reports. They shared crime scene photos, notes, witness statements. The similarities were too exact to ignore. Some detectives believed it was a single man, maybe a vagrant or a railway worker. Others thought it could be a group, a cult perhaps, performing rituals under the cover of night. But the strangest detail was always the same: the covered mirrors. In many belief systems, mirrors reflect the soul. Covering them after death was an old superstition, meant to stop spirits from becoming trapped. Did the killer believe that? Or was he trying to stop something from looking back at him? Theories grew darker. Some said he killed to feed an obsession, that the act itself brought him peace. Others believed he was driven by religious delusion, thinking he was cleansing sin. And then there were those who thought he was possessed, a vessel for something inhuman, something ancient. Whatever the truth, he was always one step ahead. Railway workers occasionally recalled seeing a strange man at depots late at night. He wore dark clothes, kept to himself, and carried a small satchel. When questioned, he claimed to be a carpenter, moving from town to town for work. No one suspected anything, until after another family turned up dead. By then he was gone, miles away. In 1915, a private detective named James Wilkerson began his own investigation. He believed the killer was William Mansfield, the same man suspected by the Villisca investigators. Mansfield had worked on rail lines across the Midwest. He had a violent past and was known for sudden fits of rage. Wilkerson traced his movements and found that Mansfield had been near several towns on the very nights the murders occurred. Wilkerson presented his evidence to the authorities. He even claimed that Mansfield had killed his own wife, child, and in-laws years earlier with an axe. But the evidence was circumstantial. Without witnesses or physical proof, the courts refused to prosecute. Mansfield was released, free to disappear again. Still, Wilkerson was convinced. He said, "Wherever the trains go, the murders follow." Years passed. The killings slowed, then stopped. Or perhaps they simply moved elsewhere, buried in forgotten police files. But the fear never left. In Villisca, the Moore house became a dark symbol. Locals avoided it. Some said they heard the cries of children echoing from the upstairs rooms. Others swore they saw a figure standing at the window watching the street long after midnight. Tourists began to visit, drawn by the mystery. They wanted to see where the axe fell, where innocence ended. But even they didn't stay long. The air inside felt heavy, unnatural. Some claimed their cameras malfunctioned, their phones died, their hearts raced without reason. One visitor described it perfectly. It's as if the house remembers. By the 1920s, Villisca tried to move on. The house was repaired and rented to families who didn't believe in ghosts, but each tenant left within months. Strange sounds in the night. Objects moving. The faint scent of iron and wood smoke in empty rooms. No one could explain it. Over the decades, historians and crime writers returned to the case. Some said Reverend Kelly was guilty after all. Others blamed Mansfield. A few proposed new names, drifters lost to time. But one theory stood out, that the Villisca axe murders were just one chapter in a nationwide story. In 2017, a researcher named Bill James published a book called The Man from the Train. He spent years analyzing hundreds of old crime reports and railway maps. His conclusion was terrifying. He believed he had found the same killer's pattern stretching across America from 1898 to 1912. Dozens of families, all near railways, all killed the same way. James even claimed to have found the man's name, Paul Mueller, an immigrant from Germany who vanished after committing a similar murder in Massachusetts years before Villisca. Mueller was a carpenter, a traveler, and he fit every detail. If James was right, then the Villisca axe murders weren't an isolated tragedy. They were the last known act of one of history's most prolific serial killers. The theory gave the story a face, but it didn't bring peace. Because whether it was Mueller, Mansfield, or someone else entirely, the killer was never caught. And so, Villisca remains frozen in time, a quiet town haunted by a century-old shadow, a place where faith met fear, and innocence met evil. The trains that once carried the killer's footsteps still pass through the town at night. Their distant whistles echo in the darkness like a memory that refuses to fade. And for those who stand near the tracks, watching the lights vanish into the horizon, one thought lingers. Somewhere out there, the man from the train might still be traveling. Night falls differently in Villisca. It's quieter, heavier, as if the air itself remembers the screams that once echoed through its streets. The Moore House still stands on the corner of 2nd Street, its white walls and dark roof almost too perfect, too preserved. A century has passed, but time feels reluctant to move on there. The past clings to every beam, every floorboard, every nail. Locals still walk past it with unease. Some cross to the other side of the road. Children dare each other to look through the windows, though most can't hold their gaze for long. Inside, the air feels colder than it should. Even in summer, the chill lingers. In the years after the murders, families tried to make the house a home again. They repainted the walls, replaced the furniture, and filled the rooms with laughter, but it never lasted. They complained of footsteps at night, doors creaking open by themselves, whispers that seemed to rise from the floors. Some said they heard a man's voice murmuring scripture. Others swore they saw the outline of a woman standing at the top of the stairs, her face hidden in shadow. The last family to live there in the 1940s moved out suddenly. They left furniture, dishes, clothes, everything. When neighbors asked why, the father said only one thing: the children are afraid to sleep. For decades, the house sat empty, neglected but never forgotten. People in Villisca didn't speak of it openly. They called it that house or simply the place. But at night, the silence around it felt alive. In the late 1990s, the house was restored to its original 1912 condition. The new owner removed all modern furniture and recreated every detail from that night. The oil lamps, the iron bed frames, even the lace curtains. It became a museum, a memorial, and for some, a gateway into the unknown. Visitors began to claim strange experiences. A woman fainted in the parlor after feeling someone tug her hair. A group of students heard children laughing upstairs when no one was there. One man staying overnight woke to find tiny handprints pressed into the dust beside his bed. The most disturbing report came from a paranormal investigator in 2014. He was part of a small team, conducting an overnight study. Around 2 a.m., he was found collapsed in the same bedroom where the Moore children were killed. He had stabbed himself in the chest with his own knife. He survived but claimed afterward that something had whispered to him, over and over telling him to do it. The incident reignited fear across Villisca. Some called it coincidence, others called it proof. The owner temporarily closed the house, but demand to visit only grew stronger. What keeps drawing people there isn't just the horror of the murders. It's the feeling that something was left behind. The question of whether evil can stain a place so deeply that it never leaves. Modern investigators have tried to explain the events rationally. Sound engineers say the creaks and whispers are caused by the house's old wood and shifting foundation. Cold spots might be drafts from the unsealed windows. The children's laughter could be interference from passing radios. But those who have stayed inside disagree. They say it's something else, something conscious. EVP recordings have captured faint voices saying names, praying, even pleading for help. Shadow figures have been seen moving across walls. Lights flicker even when the power is off. Dogs refuse to enter the property. Paranormal experts call it one of the most active haunted locations in America. But not everyone believes in ghosts. Some believe what lingers there isn't the spirits of the dead, but the memory of violence itself, a kind of psychic echo that replays the terror over and over, like a scar on the land. Yet even that doesn't explain everything. A few historians argue that the house might have been marked long before the murders. There were rumors of an earlier tragedy on the same plot of land, though no official record survives. Others say Reverend George Kelly, the preacher once accused of the murders, performed secret rituals in town before his arrest. Some locals whispered that he wasn't insane but cursed. When the murders happened, the entire town turned to religion. Churches overflowed with people desperate for comfort. Pastors warned that the devil had walked through Villisca. Parents forbade their children from playing outside after dark. The once friendly town became divided by fear and suspicion. Over time, the story turned into legend. The name Villisca became synonymous with horror, like Salem or Amityville. But unlike those tales, this one was real. The blood that soaked the walls wasn't fiction. The victims had names, faces, dreams. Modern forensic experts have revisited the evidence using new technology. DNA testing, crime scene analysis, behavioral profiling, all tools that didn't exist in 1912. Yet even with all of it, the truth remains just out of reach. The evidence was too old, the records incomplete. Some believe the police never wanted the real answer. In small towns, reputation matters more than truth. Admitting the killer might have been someone local, someone respected, would have destroyed the community. So they let the mystery fade, quietly, hoping time would erase it. But time doesn't erase everything. Every June, near the anniversary of the murders, strange events are reported in Villisca. Lights flicker in the house when it's empty. Locals claim to hear distant crying carried by the wind. Train whistles echo at odd hours, though no trains are scheduled. It's as if the past insists on being remembered. Some nights, paranormal teams gather outside the Moore house, their equipment humming softly. They wait for signs, questions whispered into the dark. Sometimes the air grows cold and still. Sometimes the recorders capture nothing but static. But every once in a while a soft voice breaks through. A child's laugh, a single word, or the faint sound of footsteps. Even skeptics leave unsettled. The Villisca axe murders are more than a mystery. They are a mirror held up to human fear, to our need to understand evil, to find meaning in chaos. We want to believe that monsters are rare, that they live far away. But Villisca reminds us that evil can live next door, hidden behind a neighbor's smile, waiting for nightfall. Over a century later, no one knows who killed the Moore family. But in a way, the killer's shadow still walks among us. Every generation finds their own version of Villisca, a story that reminds them how fragile safety really is. And perhaps that's why the house endures. Because it's not just a crime scene. It's a warning, a reminder that evil doesn't need a name to be real. Sometimes it just needs a quiet town, a dark night, and a door left unlocked. When the sun rises over Villisca, the light feels different. It's softer, quieter, as if the town itself is still afraid to wake. More than a century has passed since that terrible night. Yet the shadows it cast have never truly lifted. The house on 2nd Street remains silent and unchanged, a monument to questions that will never be answered. Tourists arrive from across the country, some out of curiosity, others chasing proof of the supernatural. They take photos of the White House, Listen to the guide's rehearsed story and pretend to understand what happened here. But the real truth is buried under layers of silence and pain that no camera can capture. Inside, the air feels still. Each room seems to hold its breath. The walls, scrubbed clean countless times, still seem to remember. A faint scent of old wood and dust lingers. When the wind moves through the cracks, it almost sounds like someone whispering. People who stay overnight say it's impossible to sleep. They hear footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. They hear the creak of a door opening and closing. Some hear a woman humming softly, a lullaby that ends too soon. One man described feeling small hands tug at his blanket. Another woke to the sound of heavy breathing beside his bed, though he was completely alone. Not everyone believes them, but those who've spent the night never speak of it casually. They always lower their voices, as if afraid the house is listening. The Moore family's descendants rarely speak to the press. For them, it's not a legend or a ghost story. It's a wound that never healed. Every generation inherits the silence. Some refuse to visit the town at all. Others go once, stand outside the house, and leave without saying a word. In Villisca itself, the locals have learned to live with the story. They sell souvenirs, guide tours, and keep the legend alive. But behind their smiles is fatigue. They've told this story too many times. They've watched strangers treat their tragedy like entertainment. One old resident once said, "It's not the ghosts that haunt us. It's the memory." And maybe that's true. Because the real horror of Villisca isn't just the blood or the brutality, it's how easily the world moved on. The murders shocked the nation in 1912. Newspapers printed front-page stories. Detectives from several states arrived. Dozens of suspects were questioned. Farmers, drifters, preachers, even family members. But the case never found solid ground. There were false confessions, political cover-ups, and media frenzy. When Reverend George Kelly was arrested, people thought the nightmare was over, but his trial collapsed in confusion and he walked free. After that, the case quietly disappeared from headlines. For decades, the murders became a cautionary whisper. Parents told children not to answer doors after dark. Travelers avoided the town altogether. The name Villisca carried a weight it never shook off. Even today, people who visit say there's something unnatural about the quiet. At night, the air feels thick. Time seems to slow. It's as if the town still lives between 2 centuries, between life and death, between what's known and what's hidden. Historians have tried to make sense of it, searching through old police files, witness statements, and forgotten evidence. They find contradictions everywhere. The timeline doesn't fit. The suspects overlap. Motives shift. Every answer opens a new question, and so the case remains unsolved, not just legally but emotionally. No one knows why the killer spared the neighbors, why every mirror in the house was covered, or why every face of the victims was hidden under blankets. It wasn't just murder. It felt like ritual. Some experts believe the killer returned to the scene later that night. The oil lamps were adjusted carefully. The house was locked from the inside. It was as if someone wanted time to stop, to freeze that moment forever. In a way, they succeeded. Villisca never escaped that night. It exists in the same moment, repeated endlessly in stories, books, and whispered warnings. Today, paranormal investigators call it one of the most haunted homes in America. But beneath the ghost stories lies something deeper, a reflection of how fragile we are, how evil doesn't always come from strangers, and how even the smallest town can hold the darkest secret. Visitors often leave small tokens at the house: a flower, a note, a toy left on the floor of the children's room. They whisper prayers, hoping the lost souls will finally rest. But perhaps the spirits don't want rest. Perhaps they stay because no one ever truly listened. Late at night, when the tours are over and the lights go out, the house settles into its familiar silence. The moonlight seeps through the curtains, the wind sighs through the cracks, and for a moment it feels almost peaceful. Then a floorboard creaks upstairs. A faint laugh echoes through the hall. A whisper trails down the staircase. Maybe it's the house breathing. Maybe it's memory repeating itself. Or maybe, after all these years, someone is still waiting to be found. The Villisca axe murders are more than a story from history books. They are a reminder that the past never truly dies. It hides in forgotten places, waiting for someone to listen, to remember, to care. And if you ever stand outside that quiet White House on a cold night, you might hear it too. The soft hum of an oil lamp, the faint echo of footsteps, and the lingering question that has haunted Villisca for more than 100 years. Who really killed the Moore family? No one knows. Maybe no one ever will. But one thing is certain, the house still remembers. And it's still waiting.